instead of this entirely being about behavioral economics and of course your research, I thought we'd start a little bit about your life. Where you grew up, what you studied, what inspired you to take economics and then specialize in, I believe, neoclassical and behavioral economics later on. So yeah,
Yes. Okay, so quickly, I grew up in India, in Punjab.
yeah,
So my dad was a university professor. So I was sort of born and brought up on university campuses throughout my life there. And my grandfather was a doctor. So academics have been sort of in the family. And as I grew up on the campus, most of the people I was running into were other university academics. And most of the visitors in the house also happened to be sociologists, political scientists. So I grew up sort of thinking this is where people normally lead their lives, talking about societal issues, about history, about culture, about economy. So it didn't occur to me to do anything else but to also be an academic. So I studied at the same university and Punjab School of Economics, studied my bachelor's and my master's in economics honors. And I stood first in every single exam I wrote for about 5 years during that period. So I thought I'd learned a great deal. And then I moved on. My dad suggested I now go and study at the best place in India, which was the Delhi School of Economics. So I applied to the Delhi School of Economics. I came first in the entrance exam, and I thought, well, understand everything that's going on in economics now. And it didn't take me long to realize there in Delhi School of Economics how much out of my depth I was. So the stuff I was learning at the Punjab School of Economics, although some of my teachers had studied abroad, say, there was someone who had a PhD from Glasgow, somebody had a PhD from Birmingham, there was somebody who had a PhD from Wayne State, but they'd not probably kept themselves up to. It was a reasonably good program, but still, they were teaching stuff that went extinct circa mid 70s or 1970-ish. So it was an uphill struggle for me at Delhi School of Economics, trying to catch up with people, very smart people who had been to the Delhi college system, who'd been learning stuff far more advanced than I did. So I was doing my MPhil there. So by the time I sort of thought I'd got a bit, the MPhil completed. So I applied for a Commonwealth scholarship to do a PhD abroad. So I was the only Indian that year to be selected in the Commonwealth PhD program. One of my teachers was Kaushik Basu, who was the economic advisor to the government later on in India, and also, I believe, one of the chief economic advisor to the World Bank later on also. So I applied to a bunch of places, obviously, and so he said, go to Toronto, which is one of the places I was admitted to, because he said it is the highest ranking of all the places. So just for so at that point in time, London School of Economics was the highest ranked place in Europe and Asia.
right,
And that was 17th in the world in economics.
right,
Toronto was 11th
right.
in the world in economics. So he said it's a no-brainer of all the places you've been in. So I left my Commonwealth scholarship and the other admissions went to Toronto. And then another horrible bout of realization that I'm totally out of my depth, because what I had learned at the Delhi School of Economics had gone extinct circa 1985-ish. That wasn't very relevant either. So I really started learning anew. And it's really Toronto that taught me what economics is from scratch. And the opportunity to teach undergraduate students, which every PhD student in the North American system has to do,
Right.
was very valuable. And the fact that you have to do 2 years of coursework before you do your thesis, which was not a feature of British universities then, but now it is.
Right.
Now you want to go to Warwick or UCL or LSE or Oxbridge, you have to do formal courses before you start writing your thesis. It used to be the case here that you do your bachelor's and start writing your PhD thesis. But then it means you don't really have all the tools that you need.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you're very bright to be in one of these top places and you learn the tools as you go along. But there's nothing like going through a really rigorous program of study for a couple of years in the PhD program. So after Toronto, lectureship at the University of Essex. That was my first job. Then I moved to University of Newcastle for a few years, and Leicester since 2003 as a lecturer. So in 2007, I became a senior lecturer. In 2010, I became a reader. In 2012, I became a full professor. So there's really no scope for further promotions. The economics I'd learned all along was, as you said, neoclassical economics, which took its inspiration from physics. So the idea was to model humans like they're particles. And so they lack emotions, they lack any concept of what is a fair outcome, they lack any notion of what being altruistic or envious means. They lack that they have infinite self-control. So they're guided by cost-benefit analysis in making decisions, such as setting marginal revenue equals to marginal costs sort of function. So when I arrived in 2003 in Leicester, I saw an advertisement for a talk by Professor alNabihi. Very interesting individual, half German, half Egyptian Arab, and also comes from a family of academics. So in his talk, he stood up in front of us and said, so he was talking about how people make decisions under risk and uncertainty. And the leading neoclassical theory is expected utility theory. So you look at a risky situation, and across all risks, you take your average utility. Okay. So that's the meaning of expected utility theory. That's what I've been taught, and that's a foundation on which economics rests. So he stood up in front of us and he said, guys, this theory is empirically rejected. Now that was a blow, because it's like doing physics and someone stands up in front of you and says, guys, atoms really exist only in your imagination. They're not real. But what do you do after that? Because everything that all the handles, all the levers that you have learned over the years to operate within economics rely on using that particular theory. And he said, there's an alternative. And the alternative, he said, was prospect theory, which was due to two economists, Daniel Kahneman, who has written this very well-known book, Thinking Slow and Fast, and who got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2003, and Amos Tversky, who sadly died when he was 57, skin cancer, and the Nobel Prize cannot be given posthumously. So he missed out on the Nobel Prize, but he would have got the Nobel Prize had he been alive. And he said, this explains all the known puzzles of expected utility theory and explains the relevant evidence. So if you want to do meaningful research in economics, you do prospect theory. That was all a big shock to the system. Hang on, all the stuff I had been learning in the bachelor's, in the master's in India, the MPhil, the master's in Toronto, the PhD economics in Toronto, you mean to tell me that last 13 years have been a waste? 13, 14 years have been a waste? So there was one of two routes to take at that point in time. I could have just said, fine, that's the way life is. I can continue writing research papers in neoclassical economics, and that's the dominant way of thinking in economics. I'll keep getting published. Hopefully, if I'm very, very lucky, I might become a full professor one day. Because in British universities, most people retire at sort of senior lecturer sort of level. The alternative way was risky. It was to follow the evidence. It was to follow good practice in the natural sciences. Be willing to jettison theories that are rejected by the evidence and go for theories that are supported instead by the evidence. So I took the latter route, the riskier route, to the path less traveled, if you will, and it's turned out good.
Yeah, I mean, it has turned out good. I know for a fact that you published a book, Foundations of Behavioral Economic Analysis, which you took 10 years to write, and it's highly commended by multiple economists. What was that journey like? Why did it take so long?
It's probably I'm a bit dumb, as so maybe it would have taken a cleverer person somewhat shorter time to write. It, I mean, a couple of reasons why it took a long time to write. One, I had no clue. So it's a bit like The Matrix, the film. So he gives you a choice between a blue pill and a red pill.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he says, if you take this pill, and then you'll see how deep the rabbit hole goes. So, in a sense, I really did not have any clue how deep the rabbit hole goes. So when I started getting into it, I started writing the book sort of 2004-ish. That's because once Professor alNabihi mentioned prospect theory, I took a set of outstanding puzzles I knew nobody had solved for the last 30 years, but I knew them from a PhD program in Toronto. I said, if this theory is so good, prospect theory that he says is, let me try to solve these puzzles with this theory. And it just took me 2 weeks to do that. That's not because I'm clever, that's because the theory is so good.
Yeah.
It just enabled me to explain these outstanding puzzles. So after 2 weeks, I took that to his table and showed it to him. And he said, yes, exactly. That, these puzzles indeed can be resolved using prospect theory. But then that whetted my appetite. I wanted to know more. What else is out there? And there wasn't any graduate level book you could, pick off the shelf and read and make yourself literate in the subject. If you're brave, you could trawl through a couple of thousand articles in the journals and try to see if you make sense of it, all with different notation, all making different points, no unified treatment. Imagine if for an A-level book you had to do that, if you didn't have a proper book and you had all this stuff was all over the place in a disorganized manner and you couldn't identify which was not. So I thought I'd start writing a book, and I thought maybe it's prospect theory and a couple of other things. That's in the behavioral economics. I was so wrong. And as I started writing the book, and the more I read, the more I realized how ignorant I was and how little I knew. But that meant spending enormous amount of time downloading these research papers, reading them, making sense in them, seeing if there was a pattern in this literature. Is there a way this whole stuff can be strung together? Does it hold together in a systematic manner? And some of the stuff was frankly too advanced for a graduate book. That it's really research level stuff. So it had to be simplified, but that meant spending enormous hours simplifying these complex mathematical models in a form that would be that someone who's doing, say, graduate economics, PhD economics would be able to understand. And hence the time delay. And whilst writing the book, lots of people got wind of it, and they started asking me for book drafts. Whilst the book was being written, it started being taught in the second year of the PhD program at MIT. And other notable people started teaching and started giving me some feedback. But then they alerted me to other stuff that I didn't know about. And that would start another round of exploration. And so it eventually became like a 2,000-page book. And then Oxford told me that there's a physical limit to how thick a book can be before the binding starts giving way at the seams. Wow. And that was like 1,800 pages. So with great difficulty, I shortened it to 1,796 pages. And then they had to hire a specialist firm in Glasgow to bind it.
Wow.
This is the longest book, I'm told, in the history of Oxford University Press since 1430 something, wow. Whatever. And it's obviously too inconvenient to carry it around. So that's why it's been split up into 7 volumes, revised and updated a bit.
That's fantastic. 17,900. Yes,
70.
1,796 pages.
Yes. Yes.
Amazing, amazing. So we can clearly see behavioral economics is such a broad field. How would you simplify that down to someone who's never heard of it before? What would you say to them?
Yeah. So, in the 1930s and 40s, economics had a choice. How should we write economics? Before that, it was written in plain English language. So people started giving models of world, simplified models of reality, using plain English language. But that's sort of cumbersome. It's a bit like writing advanced physics in plain English. At some point, you're going to need the discipline of the mathematical model, the formulae to help guide your intuition and make sharper predictions, which can then be taken to the data and be tested. So the alternative was to look at biology. After all, you were trying to make predictions about how humans behave. So should you be looking at inanimate particles in physics? Or should you be looking at how other animals and particularly close primate relatives behave? So economists went the physics way.
Yeah.
That's because a lot of these earlier pioneers like Paul Samuelson and others background in maths and physics.
Yeah.
Now, perhaps that was a mistake, and we started looking at humans very mechanistically. And then once you start writing theories with particles in mind and not humans, it's a matter of time before the empirical evidence starts stacking up against it. And as the empirical evidence kept stacking up, you need an alternative way of describing those models. And it's almost obvious that the change that you need to make to the existing method would be to bring in more psychology, more biology, more sociology, more anthropology, and recently more neuroscience. So it's an interdisciplinary approach, which how the human mind works, memory, how do we retrieve things from memory, what stuff do we give attention to, how do we perceive the world out there. Sociologists and anthropologists have a lot of insight. Others, anthropologists would say, how do people live in small groups, small group societies? Sociologists will tell you how you network with the rest of society. You might have a social identity, and you might have an in-group versus out-group, for example. You might favor the in-group relative to the out-group. Neuroscience might tell you which part of your brain exhibits electrical activity when you make particular economic decisions. So you might lie, but the brain won't lie. So if you could somehow peep into the brain and see which bits are being lit up with electrical activity when you're making economic decisions, that would really give us a lot of insights about human behavior, and they have. The other important thing is how have we evolved to be what we are? I mean, we've not suddenly been planted here on Earth to start making economic decisions. We go back to amoeba. We go back to single-celled creatures. Okay, so what was that journey like, and how did we evolve? So if we evolved in an environment where losses were very difficult to bear, for example, food was scarce, then we would be particularly concerned about losses relative to gains. And that's exactly what we see. It turns out that we are loss averse. So if you have a gain of about 100, it looks like a gain of about 100. But if you have a loss of 100, someone drops you 100 pounds, it feels like a loss of 2.5 times 100 on average. It looks like, to your mind, you can mentally code that as a loss of 250 pounds. Now that has an evolutionary basis. So there's no way you could just do neoclassical economics and make sense of human decisions. And so behavioral economics is an eclectic mix of insights from several different areas. It's very exciting. It's the future of economics. And I wouldn't say that the entire profession is converted yet, because lots of awful academic reputations rest on maintaining the status quo.
Yeah.
Because they've been working in neoclassical economics, and then what happens to their research and their if indeed the evidence rejects most of the stuff they do. So they obviously want to push back on it, but they'll only be able to push back for a limited amount of time. It's a matter of time. The stuff they do, I believe, will only be a footnote in the history of ideas 25 years from now. But now if you go to uni, want to study economics, that's about the only thing you'll study. And nobody might even mention behavioral economics, unless you've got one or two lecturers or people in the department who are interested in the subject and put on a course. Disgracefully, it's still possible to do an undergraduate degree in many British universities without having heard of behavioral economics.
Yeah, so I told my economics teacher that I was going to be talking to you, and she teaches obviously A-level economics. And so she asked me to ask you, how would we change the A-level course or, any course in the secondary education system to reflect what we see now with changing economics?
So I think we've got good templates out there, and the good templates come from the natural sciences already. So the templates come from physics, the templates come from chemistry, from biology. And what's true in those cases is a very close interface between theory and evidence. You can't possibly write down a theoretical model. Okay, for example, do you do economics at the moment?
Yes, I do.
So do you know about indifference curves and so on?
Indifference curves? No, not yet.
No, not yet. Okay. Did you hear about this condition, marginal revenue equals to marginal cost?
I have, yes.
Yes. So this is an example. So it just says that the firms should produce at the point where addition to revenues by producing one extra unit of output, marginal revenues, equals addition to costs from producing one extra unit of output, that's marginal costs. Okay. So it's known as the marginalist condition. Now, if I want to teach that at 8 levels, then the next thing I must tell my students is, what is the evidence? Is it the case that firms produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? If this was physics and chemistry, then you'd have a few pages of evidence after that telling you whether that condition is empirically true or not. In 1978, Herbert Simon, the inventor of artificial intelligence, and Nobel Prize winner in economics, stood up to give his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. As part of the speech, he said, but there is no evidence that firms produce at the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Exactly the same as would happen if in physics, a Nobel Prize winning physicist in his acceptance speech said, there is no evidence that atoms exist. Now, what do you think would have happened in physics if a physicist had said that? Mayhem, absolute mayhem. First of all, physics would never allow itself to be put in that position in the first place. But suppose for the sake of argument it did. Then physicists would be appalled. They just look for empirical evidence immediately to see if what this Nobel Prize winner had said was correct or not. And they wouldn't, if they didn't find it relevant evidence, they'd say, let's reject this theory and let's look for a theory that works. Remember when the Large Hadron Collider was coming up to speed, there was great excitement in the community in physics. And just give me 1 second.
Sure, no problem.
Yes.
Sorry, just had to get my charger.
Yeah.
Great. Yes, continue, please.
Yeah. So when the Large Hadron Collider came up to speed, the physicists were excited because they thought they might now get an opportunity to learn if theory of relativity fails. The excitement was that the theory might fail, and they might learn something new, which might propel them to amend the theory to make better predictions. And Feynman, the famous Nobel Prize winning physicist, said, in physics, we are trying to prove our theories wrong as quickly as possible, because that's the way we make the fastest progress. But how does religion work at the opposite extreme? It starts from a set of assumptions, and falsifying those assumptions is never an option. So if someone says, I believe in God, then the natural question to ask is, what has to occur in terms of the empirical evidence that would shake your belief in God? Because if you cannot specify at all any circumstances that would shake your faith in God, then it's just that, a belief. It's not a science. Economics has become like that. So you have to buy into the existing theories, such as expected utility theory, and if you have disconfirming evidence, you ignore it. After Herbert Simon said that in 1978, what did economists do? They expunged him from the economics books. Nobody talks about him. His name was not mentioned once in my PhD program in Toronto. So we do benign neglect, and we hope that, so anybody who speaks anything against the status quo, so if you subscribe to religion X that has some God A, and you've said God A doesn't exist, then religion X excommunicates you. So that's the strategy economics is followed. And that's something A-level books should avoid too.
Continuing on that, you talk about this environment where classical theory dominated your education, where obviously there was very little exposure to behavioral economics when you studied economics. How did this sudden movement we're seeing in the economics field of more scientists coming up studying behavioral economics, it becoming more prevalent, more students being interested in it, how did that come about? Who started that? Was there one spark?
Well, I think Kahneman and Tversky deserve a lot of credit. And they wrote some really important papers in the 1970s. In economics, you learn that people optimize. We're always trying to optimize subject to some constraints. In fact, the marginal revenue equals to marginal cost condition also comes from an underlying profit maximization problem by firms. Okay. What they showed in the research in this is 1971, 73, 74, some famous papers, including one in Science, they showed that people don't optimize. People follow simple rules of thumb. Okay. So if I go to a new university, a new city, and I want to buy insurance, I might just ask an academic colleague in the department who's say doing finance, which one do you recommend? And he say, right, go for insurance company X, and I might. This is hardly optimization. This is just following a very simple rule of thumb. You trust someone's advice who you think knows, and you just follow the advice. You don't take account of all the possible constraints. Life's too short. I mean, if you started optimizing at each point, where does it end? Next time you go to McDonald's and want to make an order, hang on, at the cashier, you go, just wait a minute. I'm just going to pull out my economics book and figure out how to optimize my order. You don't do that. You go by gut feeling. I just feel like having a McChicken sandwich today, so I'm going to have it. And you don't try to explore what is the basis of that underlying liking or gut feeling. You want to marry someone, or you decide whether you want to date someone. You don't go, hang on, let me open my books and see how I can optimize which is the girl I should be dating. No, you just follow your instincts. Some very simple things. You ask some people, how did you decide how to marry this individual? They go, that's on the face of it a very complicated decision. And again, optimization is called for. You have to imagine all the possible things that could happen to you guys in the future, take account of all the risks that could occur, form expected utility of those outcomes, find some underlying marginalist condition, and then make the decision. You ask people, why did you marry so-and-so? Oh, he makes me laugh. He's kind. He's generous. Um, I think we might get along. That's how you go, right? You pick some very simple rules of thumb. So the work of Kahneman and Tversky talked about rules of thumb in the 1970s, which showed all these optimization-based frameworks don't even hold when you take them to the data. And then a very important paper was on prospect theory. That was 1979. And they showed how people make decisions under risk and uncertainty and departed from expected utility. I think these papers really set the ball rolling. And Richard Taylor, another Nobel Prize winner in economics 2017, one of the co-authors of Nudge. You've heard the idea of a nudge, have you? Yes, it's due to Cass Sunstein and Richard Taylor. And Richard Taylor was getting interested in economics sort of mid-75. And he suddenly got access to the work of Kahneman and Tversky. So he started off from there. So it's a bunch of people who were uneasy with the ability of neoclassical economics to explain the world out there. We're looking for ways to get a handle on the problem and suddenly start getting a few handles. One thing starts leading to another and starts picking up in the 80s and then 90s. And in this century now, as you rightly said, there's lots of students, PhD students who want to do PhDs. Universities are actively hiring in this area. Courses are being taught. Nobel prizes are being given. Danny Kahneman, George Akerlof, Robert Schiller, three very important Nobel prizes have been given in it. And I'm sure the best is yet to come on that.
Right. All right, let's focus on, the pandemic now, the time period we're facing. Can we see examples of where behavioral economics is played out in our current state?
Partly, but I suppose in many ways. I mean, one interesting thing is why don't people get vaccinations? I mean, it was the same with the MMR vaccine problem, isn't it? A lot of parents decided not to expose their kids to the MMR vaccine. And there was this one paper that was based on very few observations, which raised some issues or questions about the vaccine. And people were really taken in generally by false stories planted on the internet or stuff written by people who are not very informed. And I think this is something that behavioral economics needs to work a bit more on. And also stuff is already appearing by Robert Schiller. There's a book he has called Narrative Economics. He's a Nobel Prize winner. It's a very nice book, Narrative Economics. So they're delving into how people make stories to understand the world out there. Because the world is an incredibly complex thing to understand. And the human brain is too small to comprehend this complexity. Okay. There is what we call true uncertainty out there. But that is meant you can't even imagine all the possible things that could possibly occur. Now, in order to deal with that, in order to make sense of the world out there, because that's an innately human trait, we try to make sense of things. We build these simple mental models and stories about how the world functions. For example, in India, in very poor parts, some parents reluctant to give the ORS, which is the oral rehydration solution, to kids who have diarrhea. It's a very simple solution. You put salt and sugar, and it's shown to be a lifesaver for kids who have diarrhea. And they would not give them because their mental model was the more water they give to the child, the more stools the child passes. And they drew the analogy of a leaky bucket. They said if you turn on the tap more in a leaky bucket, it's just going to leak more. So they wouldn't give enough ORS to the children because they had a faulty mental model. But that was just, I mean, you couldn't possibly ask them to understand the complex science of disease prevention and human biology and physiology. They were very poor. They just had no way of understanding that. Yet they were trying to make sense of things. She makes sense through these narratives. And with COVID, lack of vaccination also, there have been narratives going around. And these narratives don't have a basis in science, and they've repeatedly been um, rebutted by scientists. But who listens? All these people who don't want vaccines are simply not willing to listen. So, how do narratives form? How do they continue? Once a narrative forms, and if it is a bad mental model, how do we prick that narrative and make it burst sort of like a bubble? Now, that's very, very interesting for me to see. But with COVID, most of it is actually hard science. And so I don't think behavioral economics is that big a role to play, other than nudges of various sorts on pushing people to get vaccines. But remember, nudge is a very small part of behavioral economics. When people think about one of the co-authors of Nudge is also a co-author of me, Cass Sunstein. Me and him have a book now coming out via MIT Press. It's going to be published in July, and we've got two very great people who have endorsed that book. And MIT, it's on pre-order on Amazon at the moment. So his work on nudges, many public policy practitioners have tried to use to nudge people to get more vaccines. All sorts of ways in which you can nudge people. For example, you could send people reminders. But the reminders will help people who procrastinate, but they won't help people who are already dead set against vaccination because they're brought into a particular narrative. You could send them as many reminders as you like, but they're not going to be effective.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I agree. Before I take any more of your time, I'll give you one more question. What is your advice to the younger generation, people like me who are coming up, going to study economics, but particular interest in psychology and all these different facets of behavioral economics? What's your advice to them?
My advice is to be curious about the world out there, is to have a drive to understand what is going on outside in the world. But you can't just make sense of it while looking at it. You need some sort of apparatus to think about it. And I think behavioral economics does provide a very useful apparatus. There's lots of starter sort of books, nice books on behavioral economics, which people should read for that, even if they don't go to university. And Thinking Slow and Fast is a very good example of a good book that you should read. Everybody should read. And the videos by Richard Taylor, Danny Kahneman, not George Akerlof, which anybody can read and try to understand. It's also important to realize that we must give primacy to the empirical evidence. And we should not be terribly interested in an economics which is divorced from the empirical evidence. Because if it's divorced from the empirical evidence, it just becomes like religion. You need to pit these theoretical models against the evidence very rigorously. And if they fail, then you need to have the courage to shed them. Now, if you go currently to uni, I'm also the external examiner for the Cambridge Tripos now. Okay. So if you even went to Cambridge, most of what is being taught is frankly neoclassical economics. It's not at a very high standard. And you look at the exam papers and you go, wow, how do people solve them in the time that's given to them? But the students are very, very bright and they do solve the exam papers. But does it really give them a handle on understanding the world? That I'm a little bit less sure of. But that's not just Cambridge. That's almost any Western economics department. So if you want to go to uni, don't just look at the rankings. See if they offer something strong in behavioral economics at the undergraduate level for you to know. That's the question you should ask them at the open days. Yeah. Have you put together a program on behavioral economics? Now, if they hear that feedback, then even if they haven't, they would seriously consider doing that. A few years ago, In Manchester, students raise the big issue that the stuff they're learning does not describe the world very well out there. So in order to appease the students, the university decided to put on a behavioral economics course. In the event they didn't put a behavioral economics course, I think after promising the students, so the students massively marked them down in the National Student Service course. With the result that their ranking went from near the top to near the bottom within a year. And then they really put on such a course. So part of how behavioral economics will get established is for you guys to demand that the theories that you learn be related to the evidence that you see outside in the real world. But for that, you need to know what the scientific method is. Scientific method, you need to say Popper, Karl Popper. You can Wikipedia, go on Wikipedia and check him. It is to have a close link between theory and evidence. And so that's my advice.
So that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful. Your examples were great. I know I enjoyed it thoroughly. I know many people are going to enjoy it. So again, thank you very much. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, please go ahead. But I wouldn't want to take any more of your time.
So what is this going to be used for and how?
Yeah, so my school has an economics publication. They call it the Westminster Economist. And I thought I'd interview a professor specifically behavioral economics related, and essentially for these young audiences, give them an insight into behavioral economics. I emailed probably 20 professors. You were the only one to get back to me, so thank you so much. Thoroughly, thank you.
Very welcome. Yeah. And so there will be a write-up that will appear, which you will do that.
Absolutely, and I will absolutely send it to you.
Okay, I look forward to reading it, and good luck with it, and good luck with your career as well.
Great, thank you so much, sir. Have a brilliant day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.